What do an ancient Greek man who asked why so much he was killed for it, and an anime about a single mother raising half-wolf kids have in common? Well, a lot more than you'd think, and in ways you might already know without having ever really thought about it. In fact, the basis of today's topic is something that this entire channel was built upon without me ever expressly deciding upon it. So I don't see much reason to waste time. Let's just get into explaining the movie, which embodies that concept, how failing to understand it can harm us, and the process of how we prevent that with proper knowledge.
So today's viewing is Wolf Children, a 2012 anime film with a 2-hour runtime, so not the shortest movie, but a movie so still easy to check out before the video, which is always what I'll recommend for the best experience. We'll be going a bit out of order with the plot, so we're starting with Yuki and Ame, the titular children in their early 10s. Their unnamed father was a werewolf who passed shortly after the younger Ame's birth, and so the children are werewolves as well, despite their regular human mother Hana. This does introduce some wonder into their lives though. They were already between two worlds inherently, but now, raised by a human alone, it's even more stressed. Are they people or animals? This is what the pair come to conflict over, with Yuki wanting to be human as she goes to school and tries to live an average girl's life, and Ame wanting to be a wolf as he resides most days on the local mountain being taught by a fox. It's also where things start to get interesting as their argument grows from casual talk to yells and then even to blows. Despite being of the same blood, two of the only people in the world who can understand their situation, they each confidently believe the other is wrong about that situation. They'll sit at the table together, engaging in the path they choose, Yuki doing her homework for classes, and Ame speaking about what he was taught in the wild today, each being educated and yet hating how the other is going about it. Moving from specific examples of how theirs could be right to vague but emotionally charged statements like this:
I decided I'm better off living as a human.
How come? Tell me why.
Because that's what I am, got it? I am a human.
According to who?
We see that they each feel the other should be able to understand their correctness. They're using the same words, human and wolf, they're of the same blood, so how could the other not understand as they do?
Part of the frustration comes from this, that it seems they're speaking about the same thing, but somehow reaching different conclusions. After all, what each one is going through is an experience of rejection, which leads them to develop friendship and knowledge. Now, Yuki was a bit more wild in her younger years, and so she didn't connect well with the other girls at school. As their treasures were all jewelry and cute items, hers were mummified salamanders and animal bones, leading to a lot of ews while running away. To her confusion, doesn't everyone like this stuff? Feeling this sting a bit, she makes an active effort to be more graceful, having Hana sew her a new dress specifically for that purpose. It's these kinds of aware and active changes to be more typically human which lead to her fitting in, and from that being able to gain new knowledge in school, as well as form connections with her peers, two clearly beneficial things and two clearly human things.
Now, Ame was a bit more meek in his younger years, so he was the target of more overt and physical bullying. Quite literally feeling that physical rejection, he came to hate school, spending time with Hana at the nature reserve where she worked instead. From there, he grows to enjoy his wolf roots more, eventually spending his days on the mountain instead of at school. There, in the wild, he can meet the other animals and form bonds with them, as well as learning how to better navigate and hunt. He too has gained friendship and knowledge, clearly wolf things. The siblings have each experienced the same base concepts and situations, and from that made decisions to reach the same benefits. They can each speak about friendship and knowledge from their own senses and time. They can each see how these things will create a better future, and then be frustrated when the other believes something entirely different from the same core. The other simply should be able to experience these things and understand, right? How is it so different?
Well, we have to look more at what experience actually means. Sure, they both experienced rejection. That's the core of it. There is a lot of evidence for each to believe what they do about it. They've utilized their own senses, their own emotions and thoughts to create an experience called rejection. The sights, the sounds, the smells, everything which comes with it and is incorporated into the idea. That is exactly the problem. There are differences in how they learned what it is, even if some of it is the same or some descriptors have overlap. Depending on things like history or form or time, everything surrounding that idea, which is technically the same, will be codified differently. For example, history. Yuki grew up as the tougher of the pair, embracing the wild and running around like crazy, fighting animals and staking her claim. With this in mind and expressed, it's unlikely that she'd be physically bullied because, well, we even see her fighting off Ame's bullies, proving she's tougher than they are. But as the one who has no history with conflict and no experience, he becomes an easy target, and so it does happen to him.
Then we have form. This is a story which seems to be set somewhere from the 90s to 2000s, and so we have to keep gender in mind. Ame is simply more likely to experience physical conflict because of an era where boys will be boys, and Yuki more likely to experience "ew, that's gross" in an era where girls were all told to like pink and sparkly. And then we have age. The 3-year gap between them introduces a lot of chance. Depending on who was born when and where, who moved when and where, and then the further chance of which class you get put into, you have a lottery of kids that you'll be spending your time around. The odds could line up that you get a whole host of adolescents who've never fought a day in their lives, or a class full of complete delinquents. By nothing more than chance, let alone other factors, their experiences will be different. While rejection may be the core, and could be written using similarly or generally applicable words for both, how it's created in their minds is quite different, leading to their different reactions to it just the same. This will happen with everything they experience alike, always the same words for the emotions and feelings, but never quite the same actual content to them. It's the same base reached in different ways and surrounded with different things.
So when they come together to discuss a reaction to rejection, they'll be saying the same thing without saying the same thing. Each will confidently state the word, but it will sound nonsensical to the other. This is how they end up with different ideas of what wolf means as well. For Yuki, who's been hiding that side of herself for a while, it's only come out in a terrible situation she'd like to forget. A new student, Sohei, is behind her in class and begins to smell dog from her even though she says they don't have one at home. As this drives her to avoid him, the usually liked boy only gets relentless to try and understand why, eventually cornering her to ask. This stresses Yuki out, leading to her losing rational control and using her claws to attack him in a natural reaction to danger, leading to an even bigger ordeal with his mother in the school. To her, being a wolf is being run by these vicious and dangerous impulses.
But for Ame, it was a way to escape those very things from others. The subject of them at school, he felt relief being away from humans out in nature, able to run free rather than be confined where he hates. He would never consider hurting a human when he could just run away, so to him, wolf entails freedom. So when they yell at each other about being wolves or not, they're not actually saying the same thing, even though they're saying the same thing. She thinks she's telling him not to harm other people, and he thinks she's telling him to cage himself in with what he hates. He thinks he's telling her how to survive, she thinks he's telling him how to take from others. In short, the issue is subjectivity, that nothing actually has a real definition. This is actually something shown very well when humans consider communication with aliens. Follow me here for a second. The Pioneer plaques, sent into space on Pioneers 10 and 11, contain information about humanity and where to find us in case it was found by intelligent aliens. But you can't just write out, hey, we're humans and we live on Earth, because not only do we have multiple languages ourselves, but they obviously won't speak any of ours, and further, they may not even have a concept of letters or language in general, and so we had to try and account for that with this, the hyperfine transition of neutral hydrogen. Now, it's a pretty complex explanation, but in short, hydrogen is the most abundant element. It can be understood as having one proton and one electron, shown here, and the properties of its transition has a discernible amount of time and length incorporated into how it functions. As such, those things can be defined as readily identifiable, communicatable, and objective units used to demonstrate time and scale. That's how difficult it is to find true objectivity. You have to dip into the fundamentals of physics and chemistry to be able to communicate objectively, and even then there's a heap of criticism and confusion surrounding how the plaques chose to do so, meaning it isn't fully objective either.
Essentially, the world is a subjective mess. We can say X is X, but we're never truly certain if it is and what really X even is to begin with. But this alone shouldn't cause conflict, because we can all understand that the world is subjective and agree to disagree, right? Well, we don't really want to, and it doesn't really make sense for us to. Subjectivity is rather inconvenient for life, things which either survive or don't based on patterns, simple and somewhat definitive forms of hard logic. There is subjectivity to the fact that we have to eat to live, for example. How much, how often, what from, and much more. But it is quite an objective fact that eating is required to live, whatever the expression. As such, life is built towards objectivity, towards certainty. If there is something which definitively must be done to survive, we want to know definitively that our efforts are building towards that thing. We want our work to actually go somewhere, not to be wasted.
If you spend each day out in the wild honing skills to hunt down other creatures, you want that to lead to more food, more conserved energy, and a thriving overall life. And if you spend every day doing your homework and studying for good grades, you want that to lead to a better next school, to a better job past that, and a better life overall. A being geared towards surviving should be worried about the validity of its actions, because that ensures it will find the most efficient path to keep living. Either way, you want assurance you're on the right path and that you made the right decisions, that your efforts will be rewarded. And you can't be truly sure of that in a subjective world. So what we see is that the external conflict these two experience is being caused by an attempt to solve an internal one. Even if we know that the world is subjective, we strive to make it objective. They each hold firm their definitions because they desire that certainty of their decisions, a validity to their beings. And since there is no true scale for comparison to gain that, no book we can read or vision we can have or teacher who can tell us just how to live, we rely on comparisons to the other subjective beings around us. If other people are failing for taking a different method, then you know yours is at least more valid than theirs, and so we quite inherently desire to be right as a basic means to living. It's not that we want people who are different from us to suffer inherently, but that if they do, it technically proves we're on a better track. And similarly, if we witness others doing the same things of us who are doing well, it has a similar effect, showcasing that our efforts will pay off. And so we want the people similar to us to do well. Or if they're not doing well with the same methods, we can get assigned to jump ship before we've gone too far, or to further adapt those methods, if nothing else.
It's kind of really like developing a literal path. If you take the time and energy to stomp down the grass and clear the debris and no one follows, then you probably chose a bad spot to get to that won't pay off. And if you follow the one that everyone else made for you, then you know for sure it's going to a good spot which will pay off. So the world becomes codified to achieve these comforts. If everyone is off carving their own path, the necessary comparison becomes quite difficult to achieve. Say there's only one trait out of 10 to compare, for example. You may succeed over someone else, but are you actually certain it was because of that trait you did share or the 9 you didn't? You'll push forward not knowing for certain what to pursue for a better life. So, as a society, we pre-select a number of paths and have people go down those, compromising a bit of individuality to ease that worry and also insulate a lot from failure.
We see this quite directly in Wolf Children with the farming community that Yuki, Ame, and particularly Hana move into. It's a small country town where the neighbors are a mile away at least, someone is always home to tend the farm and raise the kids, and the meals are homegrown and hearty. They kind of moved here from the city out of necessity, which we'll cover in a moment, and so Hana lacks any farming knowledge to get started and is helped by an older man. She doesn't understand why their mentor has her plant potatoes, at least in such a great quantity, more than her family could actually eat, and even more when it's something that everyone is also growing. Won't they all just go bad or make for a completely nutritionally stagnant living? But this comes to pay off during the harvest because of how many ways a crop can fail. There could be a drought which affects certain crops worse, a disease can roll through and do the same, or animals could uproot and eat a certain kind of plant in a certain space, which is exactly what we see happen with the neighbors complaining about a boar ruining their potato crop. And that means they could have to go an entire year without a crop which really bolsters their food supply, except for the fact that if everyone grows more than they need, others can fail and there will still be enough to go around. Even if one's potatoes don't come in, the next person has enough for 2 families. They have what didn't do well, but they have what of theirs did do well, which they trade for what did well of someone else's, and despite chance, in the end, everyone ends up with enough of the same crops all around.
This is quite expressly working around subjectivity, to account for differences in location, in land, and circumstance they might not even know, like how Hana's crops survive because the animals are afraid of her wolf children. They go for a communal approach and even out the results. Despite different situations and people, everyone ends up with an objective harvest. This kind of planning is quite physically helpful. It's also how Hana even got to this point to begin with. She came into this from the city with no farming knowledge, and it showed. They tried to plant tomatoes twice with some knowledge from research, and both times, whether seeds or bought plants, they failed for reasons they didn't know. The family was carving out their own path, working through the weeds to trial and error through soil and depth and how much water and when to plant and when not to, and a lot more. The road less traveled was trending them like every other city person who moved out to the country to run away within a few months at best.
However, when their mentor steps in and essentially forces them to do it differently, he's throwing them down the path already traveled. They get much further ahead because they don't have to figure that stuff out, and their efforts can be quite instantly rewarded. Much less work for much more payoff. It just makes sense for them to listen to what someone else says rather than figuring it out on their own. And then everyone gets lifted up from the sharing of knowledge and technique, even the ones who carve the path, because the more people succeeding further insulates them from disaster and failure. So this kind of objectivity can be pretty good. All of this is one of the fundamental reasons for why society keeps existing. But then, as we've seen, it is also quite literally conflict because the world isn't truly objective. This creates those sharp edges that we find uncomfortable. The issue arising is the definitive codification, where the only way to make it is to take a path, but none might fit one's life. Because the only way the family was going to make it in the country was by following someone else's orders. Hana was running on savings and her family needed food. Without that harvest, they'd be back in the city and probably requiring heavy assistance at that. It didn't just make sense for her to take that path, it was fundamentally required for her to do so. Luckily, it happened to also be one which fit their required lifestyle of semi-isolation. It was a good fit, offering the privacy which they needed to have normal, less stressful lives in exchange for the ruggedness of growing one's own crops and being far from services. The learning curve would happen anywhere, so we can't really consider that an all-around cost, and what we see is a balanced equation. For what they give up, what they receive is truly beneficial. Privacy negates the knowledge of their non-standard identity and all the drawbacks of it, and they can live a happy, normal life despite the codification placed on them.
This wasn't the case in the city, where privacy was given up by requirement. They still required a path, as you can't get a job or an apartment or go to the doctors without playing into the usual systems. But then good jobs want more availability, and landlords will want to see a source of good income, and doctors will ask for an address and insurance, so every benefit of this proximity requires being ingrained. But being ingrained demands a lesser level of privacy, with inadvertent and purposeful eyes everywhere, passersby on the street, and landlords doing inspections. This means that they were actively paying for things that they couldn't use, since they needed privacy, and all those services demanded a lack of it.
Here's a way to think about it. No matter what, raising a kid is tough. You don't sleep, your meal timing is all thrown off, you have less time for yourself overall, it's costly, it's full of new things you don't need to know, and everything is dangerous. A lot is going on, and it can be overwhelming because this is all new stuff. And yet, millions of people manage it all around her every single year. With everything it requires, they somehow end up okay. It's because of this set path. Parents follow what's been laid out for them, just like the family followed a mentor to learn how to farm. They read books, they follow checkup schedules, and if not, social services make sure that they do. Hana struggles so much, having even less time and even less money, and being seen as a terrible mother despite trying so much harder than anyone else because she literally can't take that path. She can't bring her kids to daycare because they'll turn into wolves and cause chaos, leading to who knows what when it's found out. The same thing goes for the doctor, and even then, as she wonders, do they need a doctor or a vet? What insides do they actually have? That benefit may just inherently not apply to them, even if the social conditions were different. They can rent an apartment like they have to, but Hana constantly gets berated for having pets she's not supposed to, even though she doesn't, and her neighbors hate her for crying children, just because she's doing what she has to do.
Things could be easier for her. I mean, we see that as she moves to the country and takes another path. But here they're not allowed to be because there is no path which provides what she needs. She ends up having to pay more than anyone else just to begin existing, at which point she's working while taking care of 2 kids alone, meaning she's basically just not sleeping, giving up on all of her classes, and running out of all of her money still. They're struggling not because life is inherently a struggle, but because they're forced to perform for things which do nothing positive for them. Because we structured away from subjectivity and for first certainty. If the lines were a bit less strict, this could be fine. If there were affordable apartments that would allow for pets, or at least with more space for parents and children, but those take up more space and cost more, so they're both built less, and when they are, become more expensive, which a single mother can't afford. And there's no social services to get a nicer apartment just to get an apartment. Their concern is setting you on a good standard path where you can eventually make your own decisions, not giving you the life you need directly. Everything is subtly codified to paths. The prevalence and enforcement of a single kind of lifestyle is what creates their struggle.
And even once they get out to the country, they have to take a house which is falling apart and live off of savings while they fix it up just to be able to begin existing there as well. Her efforts have all just been to reach the starting line, a subjective case in a world forced objective. Considering all of this, it makes sense why the siblings begin to strictly choose one path or the other. They've witnessed firsthand what happens from not, the struggle and the uncertainty of living a life of one's own choosing. If they were one or other from the start, Hana never would have had to take on all that pain. So as far as everything is concerned, it's better for them to either be a wolf or a human and never both. Even if they don't actively think about this, it's present in all they've witnessed. They conflict so easily over it because sticking to a path is required to survive, and they're watching the other go down the wrong one each. They care, they want themselves and their family to be happy, and so it's frustrating to watch them what feels like actively choose not to. This is the source of many of our struggles with each other, that we must choose a path in life and we have evidence for our own, and it's a subjective mess, but we try to make it fit into these boxes. With roots in survival and subjectivity, this is something that can't be avoided, an inherent truth of the world from which our decisions, our knowledge, ourselves all arise from. This is one of those points, and we will always fight over it, it seems. But is it really?
Early on in Wolf Children, Hana is taking university classes, and the anime makes a distinct point of having that class be one on Socrates, the origin of the Socratic paradox, which is what we hear in the background, and also of the method that carries the same name. And so, following this hint which was laid, we find an answer which is a bit deeper than inherent truths, and is actually against the very idea of labeling things so flippantly, even though it is in line with them. Now, Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher, the first of the big three, born around 470 BC and then executed some 70 years later in 399. However, he personally wrote nothing of himself down, so what we do have of him was inscribed by his student Plato. Part of what got written about him was the Socratic paradox that Wolf Children mentions, coming about due to two statements. The first is a supposed claim from the Oracle of Delphi that Socrates was the wisest of all people, and the second is his own claim, "I know that I know nothing." You can see the contradiction. How could a man who claimed to know nothing be the wisest of them all? Well, this claim came to fruition after Socrates made a point of traveling around Athens and conversing with those who themselves claimed to be, or regarded as, the most wise. In these dialogues that Plato recorded, he mostly asks questions about the other's points rather than asserting his own, a departure from the usual style of debate where one was trying to bring others to their distinct side. Socrates instead went after the opinion of their own idea, attacking the presuppositions of their arguments. In linguistics and philosophy, a presupposition is an implicit assumption about the world or background belief relating to an utterance whose truth is taken for granted in discourse. In a simple example from Wikipedia, "Have you stopped eating meat?" has the presupposition you had once eaten meat. So say you were speaking with Socrates and said something like, "I don't eat meat because all life is valuable." He may prod at your definition of life to say, well, by your own logic, you shouldn't even eat vegetables, or that actually by that very same logic you should eat meat, or whatever naturally comes about from the process of questioning. It wasn't an attempt at a gotcha or to make himself seem smarter, but because of his fundamental statement, "I know that I know nothing." The oracle's supposed claim was solved by showing none of the wise men truly knew anything, as they all left his conversations confused about their own views. And so by at least knowing nothing, Socrates was truly the wisest. His goal was to provide others the same means to true knowledge, rather than relying on their previous incorrect assumptions. This is what became known as the Socratic method, incisive questioning to stimulate critical thinking and draw out presuppositions. In very simplified terms, keep asking why until the other person realizes they were making assumptions, not working from fact. In some cases, these assumptions make no difference. For example, the presupposition "you had once eaten meat" can't really produce any harm. The most you could do is maybe lie about someone's moral compass or slander their character. However, to return to the film, the question, if you could only be one thing, would you be wolves or people, has the assumption that they cannot be both a wolf and a person. I know she's asking if you could, but to ask the question at all shows the idea of two paths, and asking if you could is a way to gauge which way to push them if need be still. It's sort of just like gently approaching the topic. Now, this question will guide how they live the rest of their lives, and so knowing whether it's working from truth or simply from assumption becomes crucial to how happy they can be. If they need to be both to be fulfilled, but don't even consider such a thing, what kind of chance do they have? The same can be seen in Euthyphro, one of the Socratic dialogues that Plato wrote, which is linked in full in the pinned comment. Now, analyzing a method and not the actual means makes this a bit more recap than I'd like, but there is still some extra stuff in there, but feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter if you've already read the work. But we'll continue anyway. Now, the titular Euthyphro was a learned Athenian diviner and soothsayer, although his status as simply a character or not is up for debate for sources more knowledgeable than me. Now, even though he could be mocked at times, Socrates decides that, as a claimed expert on what is pious, learning from Euthyphro would be the best thing he could do, seeing as he was on trial for impiety. They meet as Euthyphro is drawing charges against his father for one of his workers, who killed a slave, dying while he was kept tied up in a ditch, awaiting guidance on what his judgment should be. Euthyphro believes his father committed murder, and so brings those charges against his own family. This is what leads him to say, when asked what piety is, that piety is doing as I am doing. That is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or of any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother or whoever he may be, that makes no difference, and not to prosecute them is impiety. For do not men regard Zeus as the best and most righteous of the gods, and yet they admit that he bound his father because he wickedly devoured his sons, and that he too had punished his own father for a similar reason in a nameless manner. This can be a convincing definition. If anything, it sounds quite similar to our own idea of precedent, which is used in court systems every day, or at least here in America, where the intent of an old piece of paper is in constant argument. In this example from Congress's Constitution Annotated, in some cases, however, a single precedent may play a particularly prominent role in the court's decision-making. An example of that heightened role precedent can play in constitutional interpretation is in the court's decision in Dickerson v. United States, which addressed the constitutionality of a federal statute governing the admissibility of statements made during police interrogation, a law that functionally would have overruled the 1966 case of Miranda v. Arizona. In striking down the statute, the majority declined to overrule Miranda, noting that the 1966 case had become embedded in routine police practice to the point where the warnings have become part of our national culture. The past example had become so enshrined in usual life that it didn't make sense to upset what was normal, for better or for worse, possibly because of even further moral considerations of doing so. Then, each time it's upheld, the decision becomes more normal and so less likely to become questioned even further, and the ethical decisions of the future become codified as what was remembered from the past. A precedent becomes a precedent of its own. When we see how much normality and assumption stack, we can understand why the methodology we're about to see is pretty important to keep in mind. As Socrates goes on to say, a precedent isn't fact. It's simply a subjective decision from the past which has become respected, enshrined, or similar. Whether moral or not, it's an example of one case, not a definition. As such, Euthyphro amends his definition to, piety then is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. But Socrates isn't any more satisfied with this, pointing out that there will be differences in opinion among the gods, which is actually a fact to them since they were known to feud and war amongst each other. In thus chastising your father, you may very likely be doing what is agreeable to Zeus but disagreeable to Cronos or Uranus, and what is acceptable to Hestiaphus but unacceptable to Hera, and there may be other gods who have similar differences of opinion. So, even though this is a definition, it isn't an objective one. The counter-argument is that while punishing a murderer has no difference of opinion, there's no god who would be upset with a guilty man being charged, just as no one in court would be. Guilt is guilt. And Socrates agrees. However, the argument in court isn't whether the guilty should be punished, but whether there is guilt to begin with. No defense opens with, "Your Honor, my client is guilty but shouldn't be punished." Rather, they argue against guilt to begin with, either trying to say that the actions do not create a situation worthy of guilt, appealing to precedent, for example, or that the actions themselves are false. And so this idea is just as subjective a matter. We agree on punishing guilt, but disagree on what guilt is. Socrates goes even further to say that could Euthyphro prove all gods agree upon the guilt in this case, it would still only be another example, not a definition, because they agree upon guilt in this case. Under this line of thought, at best they would have a hyper-specific rule set built from subjective beings' opinions. So Socrates suggests an amendment. What all the gods hate is impious, and what they all love pious or holy. And what some of them love and others hate is both or neither, which his dialogue partner agrees upon and believes he could argue as truth. But this is where we get to some really interesting stuff. Analyzing this definition, Socrates asks a question which has had theological implications for years since. Do the gods love a pious action because it is pious? Or does their loving the action make it pious? That is to say, is there an objective quality about the action or not? To examine, he applies the following logic. A thing does not become because it is becoming, but it is in a state of becoming because it becomes. Neither does it suffer because it is in a state of suffering, but it is in a state of suffering because it suffers. In summary, an action must always precede a state. After all, an item can't spontaneously end up in the state of being held. It must first be subject to the action of holding, upon which it becomes held. The same can be said of love. The state of being loved follows the action of love. However, this causes a contradiction for their argument of piety. As he has Euthyphro confirm, for piety to be objective, which is their aim, then a pious action must be loved by the gods because it is pious, rather than becoming pious through love. Because if the latter is true, then it is once again subject to the gods' differing opinions and made subjective. However, if pious actions are loved for being inherently pious, and the gods' love defines piety, then that which is loved by the gods has the gods' love inherently within it. This means that the state precedes the action, which can't logically occur. And if you argue that the gods' love isn't the inherent quality, then, well, we're once again back at the subjective question of which quality within it do they love. As such, the gods' love can't define piety, but merely provides another example of it. It's an abstract form of thinking which relies on how we define terms and so on, but if an idea can be taken down by rhetoric like this, then it involves some use of rhetoric itself. And so was it worth creating impactful definitions from? It very well may be. For example, I think appeals to generally human rights have good results. Whether the surety of its logic or not, I think it should probably be kept. The point is just that we can, and sometimes should, ask why. Now, there's even more that follows in this dialogue, and it is pretty interesting stuff. You should check it out from that link in the pinned comment. But I think for our purposes here today, you'll get the idea if I simply summarize the rest as more of the same, until eventually a frustrated Euthyphro returns to his original definition in new words. Socrates says surely he wouldn't draw up charges of murder without having sound logic, and Euthyphro leaves. It ends with these lines from Socrates. "Alas, my companion, and will you leave me in despair? I was hoping that you would instruct me to the nature of piety and impiety, and then I might have cleared myself of Meletus and his indictment. I would have told him that I had been enlightened by Euthyphro and had given up rash innovations and speculations in which I indulged only through ignorance, and that now I am about to lead a better life." While Euthyphro himself isn't described as a sophist here, he does have the same qualities of conceit and self-confidence. A sophist, one of the prevailing mindsets of the time and one opposed to Socrates, was someone who took a combination of epistemic relativism and moral relativism, meaning that, in very simplified terms, they believed in no objective standard for evaluating truth nor ethics. In short, they found all matters subjective. Now, this seems odd. We spent most of the script saying that objective reasoning was the issue, and yet we're seeing Socrates, who, although he admitted it would be nearly impossible to reach, believed in objective truth to the matters as a positive example, and we're seeing the sophists who believed only in subjectivity as the negative one. The issue, though, rests in what the sophists decide to do when faced with subjectivity. They use this lack of truth to justify that all argument was merely the means of persuasion, making the value of reason simply advancing one's own interests. They could, in effect, create an objective truth by convincing the most citizens to believe their argument, making it the most acted upon and, in the absence of true objectivity, essentially objective. Their belief actually created the opposite state, further codifying the world, acting with impunity and confidence, even if they were often wrong or harmful, because what does it matter when there is no true right or wrong? In contrast, Socrates engaged in unbounded subjectivity constantly to try and find objectivity, introducing new ideas and questions which broke down the principles people used to simplify a complex world. The idea of one truth is what allowed for many other options to be seen as valid, as real truth could only be reached through an embrace of subjective surroundings. Exhaust all logic and all options to find which is true. Know everything that you don't to eventually learn what you can. We see how this can be important in the dialogue itself. Euthyphro was bringing serious charges against his family, which, even if they went nowhere, would leave a lasting social impact. Shouldn't he be certain he's risking this for a principle which is genuinely important and not just someone's assumption from the past? Further, Socrates was facing a trial which would eventually see him sentenced to death and was asking Euthyphro for help on the matter since he was meant to be an expert on it. Had he been able to provide a true definition, Socrates could not have been found guilty. If we suddenly learn about how important a principle is, then it's too late to properly judge its worth. We're already acting on it. And do we really want to be acting on important moments, on the futures of ourselves, our neighbors, and our children with nothing more than assumption?
So relating this back to the story, the characters in Wolf Children aren't selectively choosing points for arguments to curry favor or something like that. However, the arguments they do make are ones which go to deeply impact their lives, relying on nothing more than assumed logic. We can actually see that it's nonsensical to do so from the start. When Hana asks them,
"If you could only be one thing, would you be people or wolves?"
the response is to stare in confusion with that tilted head expression. As children who have yet to develop that kind of logic that we use to objectify the world, it doesn't occur to them that they just have to be one or the other. Due to their inherent condition as both, their instincts and their feelings that they can't help, they simply are both. If anything, you can say that the objective fact isn't a binary decision, but the lack of one. That there are wolf people, nothing more and nothing less. It's only once they're raised in the typical ways of this world that they begin to see this distinction which they assume to be true.
When we further see how facts like these can drive people apart, we have to understand how questioning that underlying logic can be an important task. After all, if the siblings came into that night not thinking wolf versus human, but instead wolf and human, then there would have been no reason to feud. The benefits of both would be open to them just the same. It's the false, staunch line which creates issues. And so a conscious re-blurring of the line is the solution we find through a bout of Socratic method, more akin to observation, rather than a refocusing of it through sophic means, more akin to assumption. Since the movie expresses assumptions under rejection, then we can find how it expresses observation under acceptance, which is of course between Hana and the father. After what appears to be a season or more of dates, the two grow quite close, and he struggles to, but eventually does reveal his secret nature to her.
It's a shocking thing to witness, and most people would run away screaming something like, "That man is actually a beast," a pretty loaded statement. If we break it down and refine it a bit though, we can find the presupposition men and beast have different qualities. It is this assumption that's driving someone's fear. After all, we spend our lives in the presence of other humans, and unless they give active signs of danger, we don't find them to be so. We have laws and regulations and common decency and a whole host of different things to prevent people from harming other people. The label of human presumes a lot which plays into our decisions to feel that we are safe around each other. But we don't have those laws or regulations or social contracts for animals, and even so, they couldn't understand them if we did. They lack the same presumption of safety due to not anything they did, but the assumption of what they can. And so, witnessing a man turn into a beast, the man qualities are overridden by the beast qualities, and fear is born from assumption, leading to rejection. And this is what codes all the family's experiences, as they constantly have to be worried about this fact. Now, despite Hana's acceptance of him in opposition to this, we actually see the same principle with her near the end of the movie. Out looking for Ame during a violent storm, she stumbles upon a bear, immediately backing into a tree out of fear as it stares her down. Her assumption here is the same someone would make about her former partner. This is an animal which is going to harm me. I can't reason with it, so I must reject it and run for safety. However, after some tense seconds, two cubs run up to the mother and they leave together. It turns out these two were actually in the same situation, mothers trying to keep their children safe from the storm.
There was, of course, potential danger. We've probably all heard about mother bears, and it's true that we can't readily communicate our logic to animals. Just as we assume about them, they do of us. But it showcases how much vague presupposition removes. These two beings actually had something to come together over at this moment. While it would be expressed subjectively, they were feeling the same core emotion, the same almost natural drive for the safety of one's loved ones. It's, in some amount of words, care, gentle, warmth, nurturing, all of these same qualities which should be something to connect over, instead becoming something to fight over due to the label of beast, which lacks these qualities in assumption, overriding any other label.
Hana can witness him make this change and not be afraid though, because in that case, with tons of prior observation, she can't draw a harsh line. Too much evidence shows that the addition of beast doesn't require the removal of man. After all, despite this feature, she's seen him take classes simply for the sake of knowledge, since he's not actually enrolled and will get no credit. He's helped children up when they fall in the street as everyone else passes by, and his job is working as a mover, where we distinctly see him bettering the lives of disadvantaged people. There is first-hand proof that having some beast qualities doesn't entail having all of them, or lacking some of the ones we find beneficial in humans. What's happening here is the opposite of with the bear. They have something distinct to come to conflict over, one being a human and one being a wolf, and yet by refusing to focus the line between the two, instead they find and bond over the overlapping qualities. Yes, he has big claws and sharp teeth and lots of fur, but those things entail the same kind of warmth and safety that one would want in a partner, provided just the same as a human would. And while a human may have none of those things, they have the same drive to better themselves and be prepared for new situations, even if the expression of that is through study in books rather than playful test fights and training in the wild. There's actually a great deal of overlap between the two. The love of reading, of knowledge and care, of wanting kids and their lifestyles, of a whole bunch of things that are able to be, specifically because they don't try to solve the world's subjectivity, but rather embrace it. They are different people with similar qualities. Hana does this again and again. She has no prior knowledge about how to raise these wolf children, but she'll keep trying, and she'll find out what's best for them as both humans and wolves, allowing her two children to take their very different chosen paths, even against what she might find best as a human. Maybe it'll lead to a bit more chaos and disorder here and there, and it'll probably be a lot tougher, but it's the only way to keep the possibility of the best result for each alive. Not to box the world into avoided subjectivity, but to embrace it, explore it in full, even if we never find an answer. At least if we embrace it, there's the hope that one day we might.
And that will not wrap things up for this one, because I'm actually planning to do some more ad-libbing adding to this onto the end, stuff that felt like it didn't need to be written down but would maybe come out more interesting just speaking on it generally. But I think one of the things I want to stress at the end of this is that in Wolf Children, this is very much expressed as something about connection, how these assumptions can drive us away from other people and breaking them will bring us closer and so on. But in the background of it that we less discussed here, so in the background of this video, but still present in the movie and less discussed here, is also how it personally affects your path in life. I guess how it really express it, something that probably me and a lot of people, more specifically my age, I think I was the tail end of this, is that college, whenever I was going to it, had really ballooned in cost. It was at the crisis levels, but still right before that had made people rethink it and say, is this actually worth it? And now we see enrollments coming down and so on. And so for me, it was one of those things where I always heard people talk about it, and it was assumed to me. There was I'm glad that I was able to, of course, but there was no idea in my mind that I would never not go. No one had ever expressed that to me, and so I'd never considered it because everything was, oh, what school are you going to? What are you studying? Where, what is next in terms of schooling? There was really never another consideration, and I don't think that's something that my guidance at the time through school or from parents would have even considered. And so to me, it was just a guarantee that's what you have to do to try and have any semblance of a life. And what that led to, as you've heard me talk about many times on this channel, if you're returning here, is that I hate my degree. I despise it. I think it can have interesting things in it, but I think that the application of it, the things that it does to people doing something tough like that every day, the ways that it's treated and the personalities of the people that I'm around, there's just something about it that is very much not a right fit for me, and I have many complaints about it overall. It was one of the fields that was very much pushed, where people were like, go do that, it'll be a great job, and so that even then saturated the market, and so the jobs were were paying much less than people expected them to, because there was a glut of this branch of the workforce moving out into it at once. And so that's one of those things where I don't regret it simply because I think I'm on the path to where I want to be right now, but it is in many ways independent of college for me. This is something that I've put many hours of work into outside of that, and in many ways in contrast to it and in spite of it, where I think if I had never made that decision, would I simply be further along on the path I wanted to be now? Or I shouldn't say made that decision, but questioned that assumption. If I'd actually sat down and thought, hey, is this true that this is how it has to be? If I explored anything, really, even another major, the way I decided it was so slapdash because, again, everyone told me this is a good thing, this will make your future good, and so I took that assumption for granted. Just to provide more of an example of, like, this doesn't have to be about connection, it can be just about generally your own path in life. It can have a great impact on you when you years back sit down and realize that the past 10 years of your life or so, or any amount, any number, any of these decisions and where you are might have been entirely based upon assumption, something that was logic or logic that was based on something which wasn't actually true, and how easy it can be that it makes it feel even worse that when you go and actually question it, you see, oh, it broke down very easily. And then one other thing I want to stress at the end here is also that in the spirit of that, this video itself relied on presuppositions of a sort, some assumptions, and saying things like that we are, I didn't expressly state this, it was more of like an assumption throughout some other points, which is exactly the idea of it, that we are kind of driven towards objectivity, right? That we are very much seeking out, like, we want certainty in our lives as an almost base characteristic of humans, of living things. And so kind of what I'd like to posit to Socratic method myself is that actually true? Can we look at some case points and different things to say, hey, that assumption that made this might not have been entirely correct? I don't think it would invalidate the entire argument. If I did, I wouldn't put this content out there. But I do think there could be some shifts on it, where through that it could evolve into something more meaningful, even if it's not outright invalidated. And so I think that's an interesting exercise that I would encourage you to do as a starting point to practice the method or whatever it is, to question the assumptions I made here and see how we can build this into something more important, more valid, more wide-reaching and impactful of a topic together. Of course, expressing my conflict of interests, that feels weird to say because it's not, but I like to be overly cautious. Doing that and asking for that in the comments below specifically is boosting engagement, and so I'm a little bit biased in asking for that, but I do love reading them and seeing them, and if someone could make my idea better, great. I will take being a little bit wrong if it means people get a better picture of an important thing to work with. So I really do encourage that below. Anyway, that was a slightly planned ramble. I had like 4 sentences to read from on that. Anyway, that will actually wrap things up for this one. I'll leave you with links in the pinned comment. Most importantly, Patreon, where these people above me on this outdated end screen help support me doing crazy stuff like this and get possibly some Q&As and different benefits there. But a big thank you to everyone for spending some time with me here today. I'll just leave you with, I hope I'll see you again soon.